The ancient church loomed against the morning sky, its stone walls etched with memories of countless funerals, but never one like this. Rows of officers stood shoulder to shoulder, their dark uniforms blending into the somber backdrop, faces rigid and eyes glazed with grief. The air was thick, suffocating, and the low hum of whispered prayers drifted through the hall, merging with the muffled sobs of those who couldn't contain their sorrow. Detective Jake Reynolds sat at the far end of the last row, shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the polished casket at the front. His jaw was clenched, fighting against the numbness that threatened to take over. Chief Robert Sullivan was more than just his boss, he was a mentor, a guiding hand through the darkest cases and a friend when the world felt unbearably heavy. Dead? Just like that. A heart attack, they said. Sudden. No warning. Reynolds hadn't cried, not because he didn't feel the loss, but because he couldn't believe it. It didn't make sense. Beside him, Rex, his golden retriever and loyal partner, shifted uncomfortably, his amber eyes locked on the casket. Reynolds glanced down, his hand instinctively moving to calm the dog, but Rex wasn't having it. The dog rose to his feet, ears perked and nose twitching, emitting a low, almost imperceptible growl that made the hairs on Reynolds' neck stand up. "What's gotten into you?" Reynolds muttered under his breath, giving the leash a gentle tug. Rex didn't budge. Instead, the dog leaned forward, his body tense, eyes glued to the front of the room. Then, with a sudden jerk, he pulled free from Reynolds' grip and trotted down the aisle, his movements cautious and deliberate. An uneasy murmur swept through the mourners as they noticed the dog's unexpected behavior. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken, his instincts screaming that something was off. He pushed himself up and followed, weaving through the rows until he reached the front. Rex had stopped just shy of the casket, sniffing the air, his ears flat against his skull. Then the dog did something that froze Reynolds in place. He let out a single, drawn-out whine, pawing at the ground. Ignoring the stares and muttered objections from colleagues, Reynolds approached the casket, his hands trembling despite his effort to stay calm. He looked down at Sullivan's face, pale, serene, almost too peaceful. Then his gaze dropped to the old man's hands, folded neatly over his chest. He blinked. There it was again, a subtle twitch, just enough to be noticed. His heart thudded against his ribs as he leaned closer, squinting at Sullivan's fingers. Another twitch. Reynolds didn't dare touch him, not openly, not with so many eyes around. He reached out, pretending to steady himself on the casket's edge, and let his fingertips brush against Sullivan's wrist. Nothing at first, just cold skin. But then, the faintest hint of a pulse. Slow, irregular, but undeniably there. His mind reeled. This wasn't death, at least, not the kind everyone thought. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to stay composed, and shot a glance back at the sea of mourners. No one else had noticed. His eyes found Lieutenant Mark Evans standing by the door, looking more bored than grief-stricken, arms crossed and jaw tight. Reynolds didn't like Evans. Never had. Something about his ambition seemed too sharp, too desperate. Suppressing his panic, Reynolds straightened, forcing a look of discomfort onto his face. He leaned over Sullivan again, as if paying his final respects, and whispered, "Hold on, Chief. I'll be right back." He gave Rex a signal to follow and made his way to the exit, every muscle tense with the effort to look natural. Once outside, he sucked in a breath, the cold air biting at his lungs. He fumbled for his phone and dialed the only person he trusted in moments like this. The call connected on the second ring. "Lisa, it's Jake," he rasped, his voice tight. "Jake? What's going on? I heard about Sullivan." "He's alive," Reynolds cut in, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "I think he's been poisoned. Something that mimics death." I felt a pulse. Silence. Then, Lisa's voice, cautious and low, "That's not possible." "Are you sure?" "Yes. I need you to meet me at the morgue. We have to run tests, something subtle. I don't want this getting out until we know what we're dealing with." "Understood. I'll get things ready." Hanging up, Reynolds looked down at Rex, who seemed calmer now, as if sensing they were finally moving in the right direction. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, his instincts sharper than most humans. Reynolds knelt, scratching behind Rex's ears. "Good boy," he whispered, the weight of uncertainty still pressing down on him. As he headed to his car, his mind churned with questions. Who would want Sullivan dead, or at least believed to be dead? And why? The answers felt like shadows just out of reach, but one thing was clear, someone powerful had set this up, and they wouldn't take kindly to Sullivan being alive. He glanced back at the church one last time, knowing he was already in deeper than he could imagine. A storm was coming, and he'd need every bit of his wits, and Rex's instincts, to get through it alive. The mortuary was as cold as death itself. Stark white tiles stretched from wall to wall, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The scent of antiseptic lingered, sharp and unforgiving. Steel drawers lined the far wall, each labeled with a number, each a resting place for those whose stories had abruptly ended. Jake Reynolds pushed open the door with his shoulder, cradling his wounded arm as he entered. Rex stayed close to his side, the dog's eyes scanning the room like a sentinel on guard. The door clicked shut behind them, and the sound echoed through the sterile silence. "Dra." Lisa Marlowe was already at the examination table, her gloved hands moving with methodical precision as she prepared the instruments. She glanced up as Reynolds approached, eyebrows knitted in concern. "You look like hell," she said flatly, but there was a hint of relief in her voice. "Feel like it, too," he muttered, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in his shoulder. "Is he stable?" Lisa nodded, pulling back the white sheet to reveal Chief Sullivan's pale, motionless form. His chest rose and fell just enough to be noticeable, a breath so faint it could be mistaken for imagination. "It's Nexitox," Lisa announced, her voice as calm as always, though Reynolds could see tension beneath her professionalism. "I ran a full tox screen twice to be sure. It's rare, almost impossible to get. A neurotoxin that mimics death by paralyzing the autonomic functions, heart rate, respiration, even pupil dilation. Everything slows to a crawl." Reynolds stared at the old man's face, still ghostly and devoid of color, but undeniably alive. "How the hell did they get their hands on something like that?" "Military grade. Top secret. Someone with deep connections and a lot of money," she replied, removing her gloves and tossing them into a bin. "Whoever did this wanted him out of the way without raising suspicion. Nexitox doesn't leave traces after 72 hours. It's perfect for faking a death." His mind raced, piecing together fragments of information. "They must have known we wouldn't question it. Sullivan was old, a heart attack made sense. Everyone just accepted it." "That's what they were counting on," Lisa agreed. "They assumed no one would look deeper. If it weren't for Rex, they might have gotten away with it." Reynolds looked down at the dog, giving him a grateful nod. Rex, still uneasy, glanced around the room, ears twitching at every small sound. "Something's wrong," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "If they went this far to fake his death, they must be planning something big. They needed Sullivan out of the picture." Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. "Which means whoever did this isn't finished. They're just getting started." Lisa met his gaze, worry flickering in her eyes. "I've arranged to have him transferred to a private clinic outside the city. Somewhere safe. No one else knows. We need to buy time before they realize he's not dead." A metallic clang echoed from the back of the room, and both of them froze. Rex let out a low growl, his stance rigid and alert. Reynolds reached for his gun, cursing silently as the pain shot through his shoulder. "Stay here," he whispered to Lisa, moving slowly toward the noise. Rex moved ahead of him, nose low to the ground, tracking the faintest scent. He approached the metal door leading to the storage area and pushed it open with his foot. Darkness pooled inside, thick and suffocating. Rex's growl grew louder, sharper, like he knew something was out of place. Reynolds stepped in cautiously, gun raised, eyes scanning every shadow. Silence. Nothing but the faint hum of the ventilation system. He eased forward, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Lisa stayed out of harm's way. Then, out of nowhere, a figure burst from the shadows, wielding a metal pipe. Reynolds barely had time to duck as it swung past his head, smashing into the metal shelf behind him. Rex lunged, sinking his teeth into the attacker's leg, dragging him down. The man howled in pain, trying to kick the dog off, but Rex held firm, snarling with ferocious intensity. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He pinned the man's arm to the ground with his boot and pressed the gun to his temple. "Who sent you?" he growled, voice cold and unforgiving. The man gritted his teeth, refusing to speak. Rex growled louder, tightening his grip on the man's leg. Reynolds dug his heel deeper into the attacker's wrist, eliciting a pained gasp. "You're already caught," Reynolds hissed. "Talk, or I'll let the dog take your throat." For a moment, it seemed like the man would resist. But then his resolve broke. "Evans," he choked out. "Evans sent me, said to make sure the body was secured. That no one would check again. You're not supposed to be here." Reynolds exchanged a grim look with Lisa, who had moved to the doorway, her face pale. "Evans. He knew the man was dirty, but this? Why fake Sullivan's death? Reynolds demanded. The man hesitated, eyes darting between the gun and the dog. They needed him gone, too close to something big. Smuggling routes, drugs moving through the ports. He found out, started investigating too deep. They couldn't risk it. Reynolds' stomach twisted. Smuggling. Corruption at the highest levels. And Evans was just the beginning. He had to dig deeper, expose whoever was pulling the strings before they found out Sullivan was still alive. He forced himself to stay calm. "You're going to repeat every word of this to the FBI," he stated, shoving the man face down and cuffing him with his free hand. Rex finally released his grip, but stayed close, teeth bared just in case. Lisa looked shaken but determined. "I'll get Sullivan out of here now. You handle this mess." Reynolds gave a short nod, pushing the attacker toward the exit. Rex stayed at his heel, still on edge. As he moved down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just grazed the surface of something far more dangerous. One thing was clear, whatever was coming, he and Rex would face it together. And no matter who tried to bury the truth, they would make damn sure it saw the light of day. Reynolds' office was a mess, but it was his mess. Papers sprawled across the desk, pinned reports peeling off the corkboard, and half-filled coffee cups stacked precariously on top of old case files. A cracked window let in a sliver of pale morning light, dust particles drifting lazily through it. Rex sat by the door, his ears twitching with every muffled sound from the hallway. Reynolds tossed another file onto the growing pile, leaning back in his worn leather chair, mind racing through scattered fragments of information. His shoulder still ached from the scuffle at the morgue, and the stitches pulled every time he moved too fast. He pushed the pain aside. Right now, it was secondary. On the monitor in front of him, the screen glowed with data on Nexitox. Most of it was classified, military-grade toxin, engineered to be virtually undetectable after a few days. Yet someone had gotten their hands on it and used it to take Sullivan out of the picture. He pulled up the latest reports on drug seizures in the city, shipments confiscated at the port, small-time dealers caught with unusually high-grade synthetic drugs. One detail nagged at him: the origin of those chemicals. Several shipments had been traced back to overseas suppliers, but no clear pattern emerged. Still, they all had one thing in common: they came through the docks under the oversight of Vice Chief Mark Evans. Reynolds clenched his jaw, replaying every interaction he'd had with Evans. The man had stepped up too quickly after Sullivan's supposed death, like he'd been waiting for the opportunity. It was more than just ambition, it was a calculated move. Reynolds knew Evans had political connections, but to go this far? To fake a death and silence one of the city's most respected officers? A knock at the door cut through his thoughts, and Rex straightened, ears perked. Reynolds glanced at the door, ready to snap at whoever was interrupting, but then he saw Tom Becker slip inside, closing it softly behind him. The FBI agent looked as tense as Reynolds felt, his usually relaxed demeanor replaced by a cold, focused stare. "You look like hell," Becker said, pulling up a chair without being invited. "I'm getting that a lot lately," Reynolds muttered, pushing a file toward him. "Take a look. Chemical shipments coming through the docks. Guess whose name's all over the clearance forms?" Becker skimmed the pages, his face darkening with every line. "Mark Evans. That son of a bitch." Reynolds nodded, pulling up another document. "It gets worse. These seized drugs? Same shipment ID as the chemical suppliers. They're bringing in both the drugs and the precursors to make more. All under Evans' watch." Becker tapped his fingers against his thigh, processing. "And you think Whitmore's involved too?" "Whitmore's too clean on paper," Reynolds replied. "But that's the problem, no one's that clean, especially in his position. He's been pushing for policy changes to make the port more efficient, cutting back on inspections. Guess who benefits from that?" Becker looked over his shoulder, making sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "I did some digging of my own. Whitmore's been cozying up to a few political donors who've got interests overseas. Some of them tied to chemical manufacturing. If Sullivan got too close to that, it'd explain why they wanted him out of the way." Reynolds rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the exhaustion. They must have known Sullivan was investigating. Maybe he got wind of the shipments, tried to trace them back to Evans and Whitmore. That's why they needed him dead, or at least believed to be dead. Suddenly, Rex let out a short bark, startling both men. The dog nosed at a cardboard box on the floor, one of Sullivan's old case files that Reynolds had pulled from storage earlier. Curious, Reynolds dragged the box closer and started pulling out folders. Halfway through the stack, Rex pawed at a faded yellow envelope. Reynolds tore it open, revealing a series of shipping manifests, neatly organized and annotated in Sullivan's precise handwriting. One particular sheet caught his eye, a receipt for a chemical shipment marked as industrial cleaners. The signature at the bottom read, Mark Evans. Son of a bitch, Becker muttered, leaning over to see. They were smuggling the raw materials as cleaning supplies. No one would question it. Reynolds' mind churned, connecting dots faster than he could process. They used official clearance forms to move the stuff right under our noses. And Sullivan must have traced it back to Evans, maybe even tried to confront him. That's when they hit him with the Nexitox. Becker looked at him, jaw tight. We need to move on this. But if Evans and Whitmore catch wind that we're digging, they'll bury us before we get a warrant. Reynolds looked at Rex, who seemed oddly calm now, almost as if he knew they were onto something solid. We can't just charge in without proof, he said, shoving the files into a duffel bag. We need Evans to incriminate himself. If he thinks Sullivan's dead, he might slip up. Becker checked his phone, his expression grim. You're right. We bait him out. Get him talking, thinking he's won. But one wrong move and we're both dead. Reynolds gave a humorless chuckle. Story of my life. He moved to lock his computer and shoved the remaining files into the drawer, but stopped short, staring at an old photo pinned to the wall, him, Sullivan, and Rex after a successful bust, all three grinning despite the blood and grime. It wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about protecting what was left of the honor that men like Sullivan had spent their lives upholding. Reynolds clenched his fists, swallowing the frustration that gnawed at him. We're bringing him down, he said quietly. Evans, Whitmore, both of them. Whatever it takes. Becker gave him a curt nod. I'll make some calls. We'll need backup, but no one we can't trust. Keep it small, Reynolds cautioned. One leak and it's over. As Becker slipped out, Reynolds knelt beside Rex, giving the dog a firm pat on the shoulder. You did good, buddy, he said, voice low and rough. Rex leaned into him, pressing his head against Reynolds' chest. The detective took a deep breath, centering himself. The game had changed. He wasn't just looking for answers anymore, he was hunting men who had betrayed everything the badge stood for. And there was no way in hell he'd let them get away with it. The night was thick and heavy, the kind that swallowed sound and suffocated light. The sprawling docks stretched into the murky water, silhouetted by rusty cranes and looming stacks of shipping containers, all bathed in dim yellow from flickering floodlights. The air tasted of salt and metal, bitter and cold. Reynolds moved silently along the edge of the pier, keeping his steps light, gun drawn and senses heightened. Rex was at his side, his body low and tense, ears perked for any hint of danger. Earlier that evening, Becker had called with a tip, an unscheduled shipment coming in at midnight. No records, no permits, just a nameless freighter docking where no one was supposed to be. Reynolds didn't trust coincidences, especially not with Evans in the mix. He crouched behind a rusted stack of metal drums and scanned the area. In the shadows between two containers, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure slipping through the dark, flashlight beam slicing through the gaps. Reynolds motioned for Rex to stay low and moved forward, keeping his profile minimal. The faint sound of voices reached him, muffled but urgent. He took cover behind a container and dared a quick peek around the corner. Two men were unloading crates from the ship's cargo bay, stacking them onto a pallet. Their movements were hurried, nervous. Reynolds adjusted his grip on the gun, every muscle coiled and ready. Come on, one of the men hissed. Evans said we don't have all night. Reynolds' jaw tightened. He strained his ears to catch more, but a sudden clang behind him snapped his focus back. He spun just in time to see another man, younger, face hardened and scarred, raising a shotgun. Before Reynolds could fire, Rex sprang from the shadows, a blur of gold and fury. The dog launched himself at the man's arm, jaws clamping down with brutal force. The shotgun discharged into the ground, the blast ricocheting through the metal corridors, and the man howled in pain, trying to shake the dog off. Reynolds moved quickly, kicking the gun from the man's grasp and slamming him against the steel wall, pressing the barrel of his pistol against his neck. Who sent you? Reynolds growled. The man gritted his teeth, sweat slicking his forehead despite the cold. Go to hell. A sudden flash of movement at the edge of his vision made Reynolds duck, and the next instant, a bullet punched into the container where his head had been. He shoved the man to the ground and fired back, catching a glimpse of the second shooter darting between stacks of crates. Rex, cover! Reynolds barked, and the dog released his grip, darting to his side, growling low and fierce. The wounded man writhed on the ground, clutching his bleeding arm, while his partner circled around, trying to flank them. Reynolds pressed himself against the cold steel, hard pounding, forcing his breathing to steady. Another shot rang out, grazing the corner of the container, and he risked a quick look. The shooter was repositioning, moving to higher ground on top of a stack. Stay, Reynolds whispered to Rex, then slipped around the opposite side, keeping low and quiet. His shoulder burned where the stitches pulled, but he ignored it, focusing on the rhythm of footsteps above him. As the shooter leaned over the edge to aim, Reynolds fired, hitting the man square in the chest. He dropped like a sack of bricks, thudding to the ground with a sickening crunch. Silence fell, broken only by the distant creak of the ship's rigging and the rasp of Reynolds' breath. Rex nudged his leg, and Reynolds gave him a quick scratch behind the ears. But the quiet didn't last. A voice sliced through the dark, calm and almost amused. Impressive, Jake. Always thought you were a stubborn bastard. Reynolds stiffened, slowly turning to see Vice Chief Mark Evans stepping out from behind a container, gun raised and unwavering. His face was shadowed, but there was a cruel twist to his mouth that made Reynolds' blood boil. Evans, he spat. Figures you'd be here, cleaning up loose ends. Evans shrugged, casual and almost bored. You really didn't know when to quit. Always digging where you didn't belong. I guess Sullivan taught you too well. Pity he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Reynolds' grip tightened on his weapon, but Evans took a step closer, gun aimed at his chest. Drop it, Evans ordered. I don't want to kill you, Jake. Hell, I liked you. But you're in way over your head. Rex growled low, his stance rigid and ready to pounce. Evans glanced at the dog with a hint of irritation. You should have just let it go, Evans said. You could have had a career, a life. But now? You're just another problem I have to clean up. Reynolds held his ground, mind racing. Evans was too confident, too sure of himself. He needed to break that control. Is that why you killed Sullivan? Reynolds challenged, his tone mocking. Too scared to face him like a man? Evans' jaw tensed, but he didn't lower the gun. You think you're righteous, don't you? Always so damn noble. Sullivan didn't understand the game, thought the badge meant something. He wouldn't adapt. You either bend with the tide or you get buried by it. You're just another corrupt coward, Reynolds snapped. Using the badge to protect your dirty deals. Smuggling drugs under police cover? You're a disgrace. Evans smirked, cocking the hammer. Disgrace? No, Jake. I'm a survivor. Unlike you. In that instant, Rex lunged at Evans, jaws snapping for his gun arm. Evans fired reflexively, the shot ringing out, and pain exploded in Reynolds' shoulder, sending him staggering back. Rex, undeterred, locked his teeth onto Evans' wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. Reynolds fought through the agony, raising his pistol and aiming at Evans' head. Call off your men, he ordered, voice ragged but firm. Evans grimaced, struggling against Rex's relentless grip. You don't have the guts to pull that trigger. Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second, then fired, not at Evans, but at the ground by his feet. The bullet ricocheted off the steel, grazing Evans' leg and making him yelp in pain. Next one's your skull, Reynolds growled. Call them off. Breathing hard, Evans finally relented, fumbling for his radio with his free hand. Stand down, he barked, voice strained. It's under control. Reynolds gestured for Rex to release, and the dog did so reluctantly, standing guard with his teeth still bared. Evans slumped to his knees, clutching his leg and glaring up at Reynolds with pure hatred. You're finished, Reynolds said, his voice cold and unyielding. When this gets out, every dirty secret you ever buried is coming with it. I'll make sure of that. Evans didn't answer, just stared at the ground, beaten and humiliated. Reynolds lowered his weapon but kept his stance firm, his heart pounding from the close call. Rex nudged his side gently, and Reynolds gave him a faint smile, grateful for the dog's unwavering loyalty. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, He felt like he finally had the upper hand. The interrogation room was colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeped through your bones and settled in the back of your mind. The walls were a dull, oppressive gray, stripped of anything that might offer comfort or distraction. A single fluorescent light hung from the ceiling, buzzing faintly, casting sharp shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. In the center of it all sat Mark Evans, wrists cuffed to the metal table, his face blank but his eyes restless, darting between the mirrored wall and the doorway. Reynolds stood on the opposite side of the table, his posture rigid, face like stone. Becker leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes never leaving Evans. Rex lay at Reynolds' feet, unusually calm, but his gaze stayed locked on the man in cuffs, as if he knew the danger wasn't over yet. Evans shifted in his seat, trying to mask the nervous energy coursing through him. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, forcing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Lawyers on the way. You really think you've got something on me?" Reynolds didn't respond, just pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Evans glanced down at it, a shipping manifest with his signature at the bottom. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look up. "That's not enough to bury me," Evans snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. Reynolds took his time, studying Evans like he was figuring out the best way to dissect a venomous snake. "You know," he began, voice low and controlled, "I never liked you. Never trusted you. Sullivan did, though. Thought you were just ambitious. Never saw the rot underneath." Evans scoffed, but the sound was hollow. "You don't know shit." Becker pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "We know plenty. We know about the drugs coming in through the docks. We know about Whitmore's ties to those campaign donors from overseas. We know Sullivan found out and tried to confront you." He leaned over the table, his face inches from Evans. "And we know you poisoned him to shut him up. But you screwed up. Sullivan didn't die." Evans' face twitched, but he forced a chuckle. "You're bluffing. You think I don't know how that toxin works? He's dead. You're just fishing." Reynolds let the silence stretch, his stare unyielding. Then he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and set it on the table. A video began to play, Sullivan, lying in a hospital bed, pale and weak, but undeniably alive. His voice cracked as he spoke into the camera. "They tried to kill me," Sullivan said, his tone steady despite the pain. "Evans. Whitmore. They're moving product through the ports. I found out, they needed me gone. Evans, he gave the order." Evans' face went white, all traces of arrogance draining away. He looked at the screen as if it were a viper ready to strike. Reynolds didn't move, just watched the man's composure crumble. "You're done," Reynolds said quietly. "Everything you built, gone. Whitmore's next, and I'll make sure he knows it was you who gave him up." For a second, Evans looked like he might hold out, but then he slumped forward, the fight leaving him. "You don't understand," he whispered, more to himself than to them. "It was supposed to be easy, just one hit, take him out, and Whitmore would handle the rest. But that stubborn old bastard didn't die." Reynolds exchanged a quick glance with Becker, who gave a barely perceptible nod, signaling to keep him talking. Evans' hands were shaking now, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Whitmore wanted more power. Always whining about how the department was underfunded, how we were getting pushed around by politicians. He said if we could get a cut from the shipments, we'd have resources to take control. Real control. Becker's voice was razor-sharp. "So you started moving drugs. Using police resources to clear the way. And when Sullivan got too close, you had to make him disappear." Evans swallowed hard, eyes darting from one man to the other. He wouldn't back down. Tried to go to internal affairs. "I couldn't risk it. Whitmore said it was just one old man, and he'd make sure everything was covered." His mouth twisted into something between regret and contempt. "We had the toxin brought in from overseas. Military stuff. Just enough to make it look natural. But, he didn't die. That's not supposed to happen." Reynolds leaned in, his face barely an inch from Evans. "You're going to rot for this," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You betrayed every cop who put their life on the line with you. Sullivan trusted you. I hope you choke on that guilt when they lock you away." Evans glanced up, his eyes hollow. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered. "We were going to change things. Make the force stronger." Whitmore said. "Whitmore lied," Reynolds cut in. "He used you to do his dirty work, and now you're going down for it. You're nothing but a pawn, Evans. A disposable one. The door swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped in, nodding to Reynolds. Becker handed over a signed confession, and Evans barely resisted as they pulled him to his feet and led him out. He looked back once, desperation flickering across his face, but Reynolds didn't give him the satisfaction of any final words. Once the door clicked shut, Becker let out a long breath. "We got him," he said, though his tone wasn't triumphant. "Just weary. Now we need Whitmore." Reynolds picked up his phone, pocketing it as he stared at the empty chair. "Whitmore's not going to fold like Evans," he said. "He'll know we're coming." Becker nodded. "Yeah. But now we've got a confession, and Evans' signature on those manifests. It's enough to start the takedown." Rex nudged Reynolds' leg, sensing the tension draining away, and Reynolds gave him a rough, affectionate rub on the head. "Good work, buddy," he muttered. Rex wagged his tail, eyes bright and alert. Reynolds turned to Becker, his eyes hardening again. "Get the team ready. Whitmore's going to try and cut loose ends. We need to be ahead of him." Becker gave a grim nod. "We will be. Let's finish this." Reynolds took a long breath, trying to silence the storm inside him. He had done his duty, but justice was still far from served. Taking down Whitmore meant risking everything, but there was no turning back now. He owed that much to Sullivan, to every good cop who put their lives on the line without selling out. As they left the room, Rex trotted at his side, a silent guardian, always ready. The endgame was in motion, and Reynolds knew that one way or another, the truth was about to come crashing down. The sterile hum of the medical monitors was the only sound in the small, dimly lit room. A faint glow bathed the bed where Chief Robert Sullivan lay, eyes barely open, his breathing steady but weak. The sharp scent of antiseptic clung to the air, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor was almost hypnotic. Reynolds sat beside the bed, shoulders slumped from exhaustion, his gaze fixed on Sullivan's face, trying to mask the relief that threatened to break through his hardened composure. Rex lay curled at Reynolds' feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained alert, as if guarding the room from any threat that might dare to breach the safe haven they'd found. Sullivan's eyelids fluttered, and his hand twitched slightly, fingers curling around the edge of the thin blanket. Reynolds leaned in, barely daring to hope. Slowly, Sullivan's eyes focused, and his lips parted, voice gravelly and faint. "Jake." Reynolds swallowed back the knot in his throat, keeping his tone steady. "You're safe, Chief. Take it easy." Sullivan's gaze moved from Reynolds to Rex, a faint smile breaking through the haze of pain. "That damn dog knew something was off before anyone else." Reynolds smirked, giving Rex a gentle pat on the side. "Yeah. Saved both our asses more than once." Sullivan coughed, the effort leaving him breathless, but his eyes never lost their clarity. "You did good, Jake. I didn't think I'd make it out." Reynolds shook his head. "You're too stubborn to die. You taught me that." The old man gave a soft chuckle, then winced, pain etched into every line on his face. "Evans? I knew he was ambitious. Didn't think he'd have the guts to go this far." "He wasn't acting alone," Reynolds said, his jaw clenched. "Whitmore's the mastermind. Evans was just a pawn. They wanted control, of the ports, of the precinct, of the whole damn city. But we've got Evans. He confessed. Now we just need to smoke Whitmore out before he bolts." Sullivan's eyes narrowed with determination, despite the weakness that held him down. "You can't let him slip away, Jake. He'll bury the truth, paint Evans as a lone wolf. You need leverage. Something that can't be denied." Reynolds nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Already working on it. Becker's putting pressure on Evans to give up everything, names, dates, contacts. Once we have enough, we're leaking it to the press. Whitmore won't be able to spin it if it hits the media like a sledgehammer." Sullivan gave a faint nod, eyes drifting closed again, but not before he squeezed Reynolds' hand weakly. "You're a good cop, Jake. Don't let them take that from you." Before Reynolds could respond, the door opened, and Becker stepped in, nodding to see Sullivan awake. He kept his voice low, careful not to disturb the old man. "Evans cracked," Becker said, grim satisfaction in his tone. "He gave up everything. Names of associates, locations of stash houses, even how Whitmore laundered the money through fake construction contracts. We've got enough to burn him down." Reynolds exhaled slowly, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Good. But we can't wait for the system to crawl through it. Whitmore's too well connected. He'll have people in his pocket dragging their feet. We leak it, the whole confession, all the evidence. Make it public before he can spin it. Becker hesitated. That'll turn the department upside down. If we go public without internal review, there'll be blowback. Reynolds met his gaze, unflinching. That's the point. We force their hand. If Whitmore thinks he's still got a way out, he'll start pulling strings. But if the public knows, he's got nowhere to hide. Becker considered it, then nodded slowly. You're right. We hit him where it hurts, his reputation. Make the story so big no one dares cover it up. I'll get the files ready. You just make sure Sullivan stays safe. If Whitmore gets desperate, he might make a move. Let him try, Reynolds muttered, glancing down at Rex, who gave a soft huff as if agreeing. Becker placed a firm hand on Reynolds' shoulder. You did good, Jake. Not many would have pushed this far. Reynolds shrugged, the ache in his shoulder reminding him of how far he'd already gone. Didn't have much choice. When you see a snake in the grass, you don't just walk away. Becker gave a half-smile and left the room to make the necessary calls. Reynolds settled back into his chair, finally allowing his guard to drop, just a little. Sullivan's breathing had steadied, and the old man looked more like himself, strong, determined, unbreakable. Rex nudged his leg, and Reynolds absently ran his fingers through the dog's fur. Almost there, buddy, he whispered. One more bastard to take down. For a long while, Reynolds stayed by Sullivan's side, replaying every detail of the case in his mind, making sure nothing was left unchecked. The room fell into a tense calm, like the breath before a storm. Reynolds knew Whitmore wouldn't go down quietly. The man had built his empire on deceit, clawing his way to the top by crushing anyone who stood in his way. But now, with Evans' confession and Sullivan's survival, the facade was cracking. He wasn't naive, he knew Whitmore would fight back. Probably with lawyers, maybe with hired muscle. Hell, he might even try to flee the country. But Reynolds wasn't letting that happen. Not after everything they'd lost, not after every betrayal that had torn the department apart. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the old badge Sullivan had given him years ago, scratched, a little bent, but still carrying the weight of every oath he'd taken. He turned it over in his palm, the familiar weight grounding him. No more waiting. No more playing by the corrupt rules Whitmore had set. They were bringing him down, no matter what it took. As Rex curled up beside him, finally at ease, Reynolds allowed himself a moment of calm, eyes fixed on the horizon outside the small window. The dawn was breaking, pale light creeping into the room, hinting at the end of a long, brutal night. But Reynolds knew one thing, the Real fight was just beginning. The grand auditorium of City Hall was a sea of flashing cameras and hurried whispers, reporters crowding the aisles as they fought for prime spots. The podium stood under harsh spotlights, flanked by the city's emblem and the flags hanging solemnly behind. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, anticipation mixed with tension, like a fuse waiting to ignite. Mark Whitmore stood just off stage, his expression carefully composed, but his hands twitched at his sides. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, he cut the image of a leader, confident, authoritative, untouchable. His aides buzzed around him, whispering reassurances, but Whitmore barely heard them. He could feel it, the uneasy prickle at the back of his neck, the way every sound seemed just a bit too sharp. Something wasn't right. Ready, sir, one of his aides asked, voice low and deferential. Whitmore gave a stiff nod, adjusting his tie. Let's get this over with. As he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent, cameras clicking rapidly to capture his entry. He cleared his throat, allowing just a hint of solemnity to touch his face. Good evening, he began, voice steady. In light of recent allegations concerning corruption within our police department, I am here to address the public and reaffirm my commitment to transparency and justice. As your commissioner, it is my duty to ensure that any misconduct is met with swift and decisive action. Reynolds stood at the back of the room, leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Rex sat by his side, calm for the first time in days, ears perked but relaxed. Becker was next to him, phone in hand, ready to pull the trigger on the broadcast. Now, Becker whispered. Reynolds gave a sharp nod, and Becker hit the button. Instantly, the massive screen behind the podium lit up, interrupting Whitmore's practiced speech. The commissioner hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as the screen flickered, displaying grainy footage of Mark Evans, hands cuffed, face pale and drawn. A hush fell over the room as Evans' voice filled the auditorium, trembling and raw. "Whitmore planned it all," Evans said, barely looking at the camera. "The drugs, the port smuggling, everything. He said we needed to consolidate power, that the department needed stronger funding, and the money from the shipments was how we'd do it. Sullivan found out, wouldn't play along. Whitmore ordered me to take him out, make it look natural. Nexitox. We didn't think anyone would question it." The confession continued, each word dropping like a hammer, and Whitmore stood frozen, eyes wide and unblinking, his knuckles white against the edges of the podium. The room erupted with noise, reporters shouting questions, cameras zooming in on his face. Then the screen cut to another clip, Sullivan, alive and conscious, speaking from his hospital bed. "They tried to kill me," Sullivan rasped. Evans was acting on Whitmore's orders. "They planned to cover it all up and blame it on internal corruption. I kept records, every shipment, every name. It's all there." Whitmore's composure shattered. He turned, muttering to his aides, demanding answers, but they looked as stunned as he did. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to regain control. That video is fabricated," he shouted, his voice cracking under pressure. "This is a smear campaign, an attack on my character. I have served this city with integrity for decades." But no one was listening. Phones were lighting up with live reports, and Reynolds could see the panic setting in. Whitmore turned to leave, but the doors at the back swung open, and FBI agents flooded the room, weapons drawn. "Mark Whitmore." Agent Becker called out, stepping forward with his badge raised. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and attempted murder. Put your hands where I can see them." Whitmore hesitated, calculating his chances, then made a break for the side exit. He didn't get far. Two agents tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back as they slapped on the cuffs. He thrashed, screaming about setups and political schemes, but no one was buying it anymore. Reynolds watched without moving, his face impassive as Whitmore was dragged out, flanked by cameras and flashing lights. The crowd surged forward, demanding statements, but the agents kept a tight perimeter, shoving microphones out of Whitmore's face as he cursed and protested. Becker walked over to Reynolds, letting out a breath of relief. "That was clean," he said. "Finally nailed the bastard." Reynolds just nodded, glancing down at Rex, who had settled into a calm, almost contented state. The tension that had coiled tight in his chest for days finally loosened, and he scratched Rex behind the ears, feeling the warmth of the dog's trust and loyalty. "You did good, boy," he whispered. Rex leaned into his touch, letting out a soft huff, as if to say it was nothing. Reporters caught sight of Reynolds and tried to approach, but Becker shot them a warning look, and they kept their distance. As the chaos unfolded, Reynolds knew that it wasn't over, not completely. There would be hearings, more investigations, fallout from every corner of the city's administration. But for now, the threat was contained. The truth was out, and Whitmore's power had crumbled in front of the whole world. Rex let out a low, contented groan and laid his head on Reynolds' boot, finally at peace after days of relentless tension. Reynolds allowed himself a rare smile, looking out over the mess of flashing lights and scrambling reporters. The city wouldn't heal overnight, and the department would take time to rebuild its honor. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like justice had actually prevailed. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, spilling gold across the city park, painting long shadows that stretched lazily over the worn paths. The breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faint laughter of children playing somewhere beyond the hill. The world felt lighter now, as if shedding the weight of secrets and betrayal that had suffocated it for so long. Reynolds walked slowly, hands shoved into his coat pockets, his shoulder still aching from the bullet wound but manageable now. Beside him, Sullivan kept pace, his steps steady though deliberate, as if he were still testing the strength in his legs. His face was marked by lines deeper than before, the kind that didn't just come from age but from being dragged back from the brink of death itself. Ahead of them, Rex bounded across the grass, chasing the wind and the drifting leaves, his spirit unbroken despite the trials they'd endured. Reynolds couldn't help but smile faintly, watching the dog barrel through the patches of sunlight with nothing but pure, unguarded joy. Sullivan exhaled deeply, his gaze following Rex's path. "That dog saved my life," he said, almost to himself. Reynolds nodded, his eyes never leaving Rex. Yeah. Saved mine too. More than once. Sullivan gave a tired chuckle, the sound rough but genuine. Always knew you had good instincts, Jake. But I never would have guessed you'd put your faith in a damn dog over half the precinct. Reynolds shot him a sidelong glance. Maybe that's why I'm still here. Rex doesn't lie. Doesn't scheme. Just knows what's right. Sometimes. I think he's a better cop than I am. Sullivan's face softened, his hand resting briefly on Reynolds' shoulder. You're wrong about that. You didn't give up. Didn't compromise. That's why we're both standing here. Reynolds looked down, his jaw tight. Almost didn't make it. Whitmore had his claws in deeper than I thought. I was one move away from being buried alongside you. The old man gave a slow nod, watching the way the sun dipped lower, turning the sky amber and soft. Power does that to men, he muttered. Makes them think they're untouchable. I should have seen it sooner. Should have known Whitmore was too clean for his own good. Reynolds huffed, kicking at a stray pebble. He got comfortable. Thought no one would dare look behind the curtain. Even when Evans folded, Whitmore still thought he could spin his way out of it. The moment he tried to run, he proved to the whole damn city what he really was. Sullivan's expression hardened. A coward. Yeah. They walked in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need words to fill the gaps. A flock of pigeons burst from the ground ahead, and Rex skidded to a halt, barking half-heartedly as if insulted they didn't stick around to play. Reynolds smirked, calling him back with a low whistle. Rex trotted over, tongue lolling, and flopped down at Sullivan's feet, rolling onto his back in an unapologetic request for belly rubs. Sullivan snorted and obliged, his rough hands brushing through the golden fur. Never thought I'd say it, Sullivan mused, but maybe there's more to being a good cop than just the badge. Maybe it's about loyalty. Integrity. Knowing when to stand your ground even when it gets ugly. Reynolds stayed quiet, mulling it over. People like Whitmore, they take advantage of that loyalty. Twist it. Make good men do bad things. Evans, he didn't start out corrupt. Just too eager to climb. Whitmore saw that. Used it. Sullivan nodded slowly. Sometimes ambition blinds a man to his own downfall. Evans forgot why he joined the force. Whitmore made sure of it. He looked up, eyes hardening with resolve. But you didn't forget, Jake. You could have let it go, let them bury the truth. But you didn't. Reynolds gave a faint shrug. Didn't know how to quit. Guess you taught me that. Sullivan's mouth quirked into a faint smile. Hell of a legacy to leave behind. Stubbornness and reckless loyalty. Reynolds couldn't help but laugh, a short, rough sound that felt good despite the ache it stirred in his shoulder. Better than leaving behind corruption and betrayal. We'll rebuild. The department took a hit, but we'll make it right. One step at a time. Sullivan looked at him, eyes softened with something almost like pride. You'll lead them well, Jake. They need someone like you now. Someone who doesn't just follow orders, someone who follows what's right. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and Rex perked his ears, watching a squirrel scurry along a branch overhead. Reynolds followed his gaze, the tension finally ebbing from his body. Funny thing, he said after a while. I always thought justice was something clean, straightforward. Turns out it's messy. Complicated. You have to fight for it every step of the way. Sullivan's smile faded, replaced by a solemn calm. Justice doesn't happen by itself. Men like Whitmore think they can shape it to their will. But real justice, it's earned. Fought for. Kept alive by people who give a damn. Reynolds met his gaze, the unspoken gratitude passing between them like a quiet oath. He gave Rex a final scratch behind the ears before straightening, looking out at the sunset painting the park in hues of copper and crimson. You think they'll remember any of this? Reynolds asked, voice low. Sullivan sighed, eyes heavy with the weight of too many years on the force. Maybe not all of it. But they'll remember you, Jake. You and that dog of yours. They'll know someone stood up when it counted. That's what matters. Reynolds gave a slow nod, allowing the sense of resolution to settle in. As Rex bounded off to chase another drifting leaf, Reynolds couldn't help but feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had seen the light. No matter how dark it had gotten, they hadn't backed down. The sun finally dipped below the skyline, shadows stretching long and cool across the park. Reynolds took a deep breath, feeling the weight finally lift from his chest. Maybe they couldn't fix everything, maybe the city would always have its dark corners and twisted secrets. But at least for today, the right people had paid the price. He glanced at Sullivan, catching the older man's thoughtful expression. "Let's go," Reynolds said, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. "We've got a department to clean up." Sullivan nodded, his lips quirking into a faint smile as they headed down the path, side by side. Rex led the way, his golden fur catching the last rays of daylight, a loyal guardian against whatever shadows might still be lurking ahead. What if today was the day you uncovered a truth that changed everything? How far would you go for justice? Jake Reynolds risked everything, Rex followed his instincts, and Sullivan survived because someone refused to give up. But what about you? Have you ever stopped to think about how many truths might be right in front of you, waiting to be revealed? Tell us in the comments, which moment in this story impacted you the most? Reynolds' sacrifice? Rex's loyalty? Or the truth finally coming to light? Your opinion matters more than you think. If this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us for more stories that challenge, inspire, and make you reflect. And don't forget, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Sometimes, a truth told at the right moment can change a destiny.